Let us, without further ado, say a very good morning to Helen Dale. Helen, how are you doing?
Good morning, Mike. How are you?
Very well indeed. I mean, it's a good day to be British, I would say, and I say that deliberately, not just English, because I think whenever England do well, it actually does kind of have an effect on all other parts of the union, whether or not you want in Scottish independence. I said yesterday, actually, that if England go ahead and win the tournament on Sunday, it will kill off Scottish independence because people in Scotland will go, actually, we quite like being part of this victory scenario, and except for the really, really mealy-mouthed and bitter people, they'll want to join in.
There's a part of me that thinks, I mean, I don't know, I don't follow football closely, although I've got the weirdest thing of I know the rules. And that's an accident.
Right.
And the reason I know the rules, to bring up the Australian point then, is I played field hockey at high school. And then as a young adult, I actually played A-grade field hockey for a while. And field hockey used to have exactly the same positioning and play rules. So the whole 4-4-2 and setting up offside traps and those strategies for playing a game of field hockey. So and the same number of players. So I weirdly know the rules of football. The difference that has happened, and I actually went through the experience of this, is that when I played hockey in high school in the 80s and early 90s, hockey had an offside rule. Now, instead of going down the VAR route, which is what football has done, I think probably to its detriment, it's taken away some of the flow of the game. Field hockey just abolished the offside rule. And I do remember when I went back to play as an adult after a break of a few years to play field hockey again. And in the interim, the offside rule had been abolished. And I was used to setting offside traps because obviously enough, I'm big and quick. So I'd either be the centre forward or one of the wings, the goal scorer. So I was used to being involved in setting the offside trap, and I could no longer do that anymore. And I actually made some quite stupid mistakes as a player, even though notionally I was supposed to be a pretty good player.
Ever work. I don't think it would ever work in football if they got rid of the offside trap. You just have people hanging around the goal all the time. It would be horrendous.
All the time. That's the thing. Yes, you would just have a person up, and that did happen. There were the number of times once the offside rule had gone, I was being sent up the field, wait for it to be passed to you, and then because of my size, people would be yelling, "Get out of Helen's way! She'll run over the top of you."
Well, maybe we could take this analogy one step further and I could suggest to you that Boris Johnson is akin to a goal hanger who waits for the ball to come to him 2 seconds away from the goal and just kicks it in, claims all the credit.
And then kicks it. Oh, he does. He absolutely does.
I mean, he's benefiting. He's benefiting massively from this football tournament because England are doing so well, so he's able to bask in the reflected glory of the football team as if it's got something to do with him.
And this is a wider phenomenon. It's certainly something I saw a lot in Australia. I mean, one of my enduring memories when I was actually in Parliament House is the Australian netball team, the Diamonds, actually won the Netball World Championship. And so, of course, they were getting a national tour like a champion sports team does. And so all of these fabulously good-looking and very tall netballers. I mean, I had the experience, which is very rare for me, of encountering a woman I met, the captain of the Australian team, and she was taller than me. So I had this cockatoo experience of looking up at the captain of the netball team, and she was the same height as my brother, and my brother's 6'5". Right. It was just extraordinary. But what was happening, I saw, the Prime Minister and the leader of the opposition and all the politicians were all just milling around in this big, in one of the big halls in Parliament House, getting all the reflected glory from the netballers. It's just such a thing.
I know, it absolutely is. But let's talk a little bit about the government right now, because we've seen a few changes recently. Matt Hancock's departure seems to have kick-started a slightly new attitude from the Department of Health, certainly from the Secretary of State for Health, with Sajid Javid. And Boris's press conference on Monday was completely different from any one that he's done before, where he appears to have kind of finally recognised what we've been saying for a long time, that you have to change the way you deal with this disease if we're ever going to get out of this lockdown nonsense.
Yes, and the responses to that have been, there are two things going on. The responses to that have been very strange, but they've not been sort of widely visible to the general public because the football story has just been over the top, as you say. People have noticed the football story. And so that's been the main thing. But the other thing is that for basically with exceptions, but for most of COVID, for 14 to 15 months, the government has been the national. It's like the National Health Service has turned into the National COVID Service.
Yes.
The government it's just been COVID, 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 COVID. So the manifesto on which Boris won that enormous, and the Tories won that enormous landslide majority in 2019, has kind of been put on ice. And that's why the piece that I've tweeted out and that you've retweeted, which is a review of this book by Nick Timothy, the chap who, Remaking One Nation by Nick Timothy, who used to be Theresa May's advisor. And now that came out at the beginning of the pandemic, Remaking One Nation. It was March, April 2020. And Law and Liberty, the outfit in America that I do writing and commentary for, where I'm a staff writer there, I sent it to me last year and said, could you review this? And I agreed that I would do that, as part of my columns that I write for Law and Liberty. And it kept getting put to the bottom of the pile as I had to write about other things, I had to write about court cases or so on and so forth. And also I thought to myself quite seriously, no one's going to pay any attention to a book full of policy ideas. They're just not, because they're focused on COVID.
Yeah.
But now COVID is winding down. One of the things I noticed when I read this book and reviewed it, and I say it in my piece, is the number of things that are in it that have been implemented by the Tories, and I'm going to mention two, and the number that you can see they're clearly thinking about doing. There's lots of noises about it. The two really obvious ones that the Tories have already done, despite COVID, is the Sewell report on racial disadvantage in the UK.
That's sort of disappeared, hasn't it, without trace? I don't know what's happened to that, really.
Nick Timothy in this book forecasts, and it's very hard to do this well, but it's based on a lot of data, that the main disadvantage that anybody experiences in Britain, and that you can test it statistically, is the social class disadvantage that we all talk about, being poor.
Right.
But the other one is coming from a broken family. Now, he couldn't prove the broken family argument in the book, because obviously it was before the Sewell report last year. Then the Sewell report came out and disaggregated all of the data and showed the extent of which family breakdown contributes to disadvantage in this country, regardless of race.
Yes, and I don't think anyone was surprised by that. So I guess the fact that he saw that coming, or predicted it in a way, is not that surprising either, is it?
Yes, but nobody was saying it, apart from Nick Timothy and maybe a few people in CCHQ. And I am aware, I know this when I first tweeted his
well, that's not entirely true,
review.
actually, Helen, because we've been saying at Talk Radio for a long time, and people like Ben Bradley, the MP, have been talking a lot about white working class boys and how disadvantaged they are compared to other groups of people in the educational sphere, if nothing else.
Yeah, Timothy goes into a bit more detail. It's not just education. He focuses on things like health issues and remoteness from work, and people who don't have access to any kind of transport. You can see where the thinking, even if you disagree with HS2, you can see where the thinking in favour of HS2 comes from, this idea of moving people around in the North and the Midlands, although whether moving them to London is a good idea is a separate issue. And the other thing that Nick Timothy identified is that he is not a classical liberal. He does not come from the Thatcherite wing of the party. He's very critical of aspects of Thatcherism. Is that he rejects the old classical liberal idea that I probably still endorse to a degree, is that you should just get rid of all these awful government arm's length bodies and quangos and advisory boards. And we've all seen Sage make an awful mess of themselves, but there are plenty of others. The Bank of England did in Brexit, during the Brexit process, for example. I could do a better job by, spinning around 3 times and pinning the tail on the donkey blindfolded. Yeah, that kind of thing. And one of the things he advocates is quite blunt. He says, I'm fed up with this lefty long march through the institutions, and clearly people like their quangos, so we're going to be stuck with them. So, okay, Tories can play that game too. And so that is why you have had this persistent appointment of Conservatives to all of the various quangos, and that process is just ongoing. Now, the Conservatives didn't used to do that. It was not considered a Conservative thing to do. They just tended to accept expert recommendations. And now you're getting people appointed who are public conservatives, or at least very critical of either the Blairite or the more hard left agenda. So they're either anti-woke or anti the kind of Blairism that it was associated, for example, with the Equality and Human Rights Commission.
But Blair kind of reinvented quangos after saying he was going to do away with them. We ended up with more of them than we ever had. And then Cameron promised a bonfire of the quangos, which again, bizarrely, ended up with more quangos than less quangos.
It doesn't work.
No.
That's what Timothy says. It doesn't work. Nick Timothy's argument is that it just doesn't work. And you just have to accept that people have decided that this kind of governance is what they want. So therefore, you are stuck with the sort of unwelcome but true thing that you have to bend those instrumentalities to the will of a conservative government if you want to enact your manifesto, basically, and make sure it works.
But there is a problem here, and I think we've seen it in both of the by-elections recently, whereby there are some conservatives who are traditional conservatives who don't like what Boris Johnson and this current Tory government are doing, and who therefore won't vote for them. And that's certainly what happened in Chesham, where an awful lot of traditional Tories didn't bother voting at all. And then again,
they just stayed home.
Yeah, and again up in Batley, where they could have won if they'd actually put any real work into it, but they were kind of considered to be not quite doing the right thing for the country, and I think that's the problem.
Well, I think in both cases, I mean, I'm better at explaining Chesham and Amersham because it's the kind of home county seat that I'm in, basically. It's that sort of environment. Is the Lib Dems, the Prosecco party, as we call them in this part of the world, are very good at running spoiler campaigns. You know, they come round. I have had this experience, and very reassuringly, after they've tapped on your door and they want to talk to you, they very reassuringly tell you that this is not going to change the government, but it's a way of registering a protest. And the thing is, in Chesham and Amersham, the Lib Dems basically threw out their pro-housing and pro-HS2 policy, pretended they didn't exist, on the basis that most people aren't going to go to the party's website and check out what they went into the last election with in terms of a manifesto, and reconfigured themselves as a hugely anti-HS2 and anti-housing development party. And also, the classic thing in a by-election, they poured resources into the seat. And as a number of people pointed out, this was the first by-election since building had actually commenced for HS2. So all the people in Chesham and Amersham were putting up with potholes in their roads, inconvenient road closures, trucks full of concrete and God knows what else going all around the countryside, and basically destroying the nice semi-rural calm of a seat like that. I personally think with Batley and Spen, now I know less about this sort of area because it's not the kind of environment I've ever lived in, and I don't know the people well, but it was a very narrow loss. The Conservatives only lost by 375 votes.
It was, and that's my point. I mean,
and to my way of thinking, only 375 Tories or would-be Tories had to be annoyed with the slowness of Boris Johnson pushing Matt Hancock out the door to either vote against or just stay home. And as a number of people, including people in my Conservative Constituency Association, pointed out, postal ballots were going in for the Batley and Spen by-election quite a lot of them, before Matt Hancock resigned.
Yes.
And in a very, very close election like that, I guarantee you that some of those postal ballots were people who were going, I'm not voting for a political party full of hypocrites.
Yes, I think that's absolutely right. Helen, stay with us for a moment. We're going to take a little short break. We're going to talk about masks, why some people are insisting that if you don't wear one, you're somehow a bad individual. We're talking to Helen Dale. Let's find out what she makes of it all. Helen, it's extraordinary, isn't it, that I've been saying this week that the mask debate is the new Brexit. You know, if you wear a mask, you are obviously a very, very intelligent and well-cultured individual who's very nice and cares about everyone. And if you don't wear a mask, you're some kind of bigoted, racist Brexiteer.
I'm actually very glad of the football. I never thought I'd say that, but I am very glad of the football. And the reason I'm glad of the football is because it means that this silly behaviour has not become more obvious to widely outside of the few individuals who are engaging in it.
Yeah.
I actually got the phrase the Church of Musketeerianism. It's not mine. It's from an American. Yes, it's very witty.
Yes.
It's from an American commentator whose background is as a grief counsellor. So he normally talks about psychological issues.
Right.
And he does a podcast, and well, it's a vodcast because it's got lots of video in it. And his name is Josh Slocum, and the vodcast is called Disaffected.
Okay.
And he did an entire episode in America because he lives in Vermont, which is one of the northern states that had mask mandates because it's very varied across the US federal system. And he did this episode called The Church of Musketeerianism, where he went into ridiculous behaviour from people, mainly pro-maskers, but also some of the anti-mask people, including descriptions of individuals getting into arguments with each other in front of him in the high street, basically, where he lives. You know, really ridiculous behaviour. And I watched his little show. He's on YouTube, and you can get it on Rumble as well. I watched it, and I was sitting there thinking smugly, oh, British people won't do that. We won't be that ridiculous.
Yeah.
We will not behave like he's describing. This is some weird American pathology. I was doing that very comforting thing that is sometimes true, that British people tell themselves, that you're not going to get ridiculous behaviour in public over a piece of cloth around people's faces.
Yeah.
And then, of course, and that show he put out at least a month ago. It might even be longer than that. And then, of course, this started to happen, and the football occluded most of it. But people wanting mask mandates to last forever, to make it by law. Even in Japan, it is not by law.
Yeah.
People don't realise this. I mean, I used to live in Japan.
Yeah.
It is considered, people often wear masks on the train, on the Shinkansen, particularly the speed trains around Tokyo, particularly when they're very full. And it's partly, it emerges from an aspect of Japanese culture. It's quite rude. You know how we've got rules about don't burp or fart on the train?
Yeah.
And people who do it are not popular. Well, the Japanese equivalent is don't blow your nose.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I think it's interesting.
On the train.
Yeah.
But it's not by law.
No.
This is the thing.
But that's the thing. But also, all the things that these people, even to Keir Starmer yesterday, we're going to have to wrap it here, Helen, because we're running late and we're waiting for some pronouncements from the House of Commons. But thank you, Helen Dale, writer, lawyer, political commentator.